New York City, February 1972. The hallway outside Studio 4 at KYW smelled like burned coffee and old carpet, the kind of smell that sticks to institutional buildings and never quite leaves. John Lennon was standing near a fire door with a cigarette he hadn't lit yet, watching a man on the other side of the corridor who had no reason to be there. Chuck Berry was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not talking to anyone, not looking for anyone. Just standing there the way certain people stand when they've already decided something and are simply waiting for the moment to arrive. He was wearing a dark jacket. He looked exactly like himself, which is the thing about Chuck Berry that people who met him always mentioned afterward. He never looked like he was performing the idea of Chuck Berry. He just was it, and that was enough, and he knew it. Lennon took a breath. There was something he had been carrying since the summer of 1971 that he had not told anyone about. Not Yoko, not his manager, not the people who had been inside that Madison Square Garden dressing room on the night it happened. He had kept it the way people keep things that don't quite fit into conversation, things that feel too specific and too personal to explain without sounding smaller than they actually were. He had to go back to tell it right. The summer of 1971, a benefit concert in New York. Lennon was riding a wave that was almost too large to stand on. Imagine had not been released yet, but everyone in every room he walked into already sensed what was coming. He was magnetic in that period in a way that wasn't always easy to be around. Too much energy concentrated into one person, ideas arriving faster than they could be finished. That night he felt loose in the way that sometimes felt like confidence and sometimes like carelessness. And he didn't stop to figure out which one it was. Chuck Berry was somewhere in the building. Lennon had seen him in the corridor earlier, recognized him the way you recognize the person whose records you wore out before you understood what records were. When Lennon was 15 in Liverpool, before the name Lennon meant anything to anyone outside a small circle of people in the north of England, Chuck Berry was the sound coming through the speaker of a record player that explained everything he had been trying to figure out about what music could do. Not politely, not academically, viscerally. Like the first time you touch something electric and understand immediately why people are careful around it. He had learned Berry's guitar runs note by note, hunched over the instrument for hours in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with the fact that he couldn't stop. There are musicians you admire and musicians who actually change the shape of how you hear everything that comes after. For Lennon, Berry was the second kind. That doesn't go away. It doesn't matter how famous you get or how many records you sell or how many arenas you fill. The person whose music rewired your brain when you were 15 stays exactly that. The person whose music rewired your brain when you were 15, which made what happened that summer night in 1971 not just a social mistake, but something that cut closer to the bone. So when Lennon walked out to the microphone that night and heard 5,000 people ready for whatever came next, he did something that felt in the moment like generosity and turned out to be something else entirely. He leaned into the mic and told the crowd that one of the men who invented rock and roll was in the building tonight. He said Chuck Berry's name. The crowd responded the way crowds respond when you say the right name in the right room, and there was no way after that for Berry to stay in the wings. Berry walked out. He played. He smiled for the cameras. He shook Lennon's hand in front of everyone. And then the lights came down. And backstage, when it was just the two of them near the equipment cases, Berry looked at Lennon and said something in a quiet, flat voice that had no anger in it, which somehow made it worse. He said that what Lennon had done was not respect. It was pressure dressed up to look like respect. That announcing a man's name to 5,000 people before you've asked him doesn't give him a choice. It gives him a wall. Lennon started to explain that he had meant it as a tribute. Berry let him finish. Then he said that what a man means and what he actually does to another person standing in a hallway are two different things. And the second one is the one that counts. Lennon didn't argue. He went quiet. The specific quiet of someone who has just heard something true that they weren't ready for. He carried that conversation for 6 months without mentioning it to a single person. That kind of silence says something. Not about guilt exactly, but about the particular weight of being corrected by someone whose opinion you actually care about. Lennon was comfortable being wrong in public. He had been wrong in public many times and recovered. This was different because it was private, because nobody was watching, because it was just him and a man he had admired since he was a teenager. And Barry hadn't raised his voice once, which brings us back to February 1972, Studio 4. The burned coffee smell. Lennon was co-hosting the Mike Douglas Show for a week, a mainstream daytime television program that was in most ways the opposite of everything he was, which was probably why he said yes to it. Chuck Berry was booked as a guest for that episode. Lennon found out that morning. He didn't send a message through a producer. He didn't ask a manager to arrange something. He didn't make a phone call. He sat down alone in his dressing room before the show, pushed aside a copy of the day's rundown sheet, and wrote a short note by hand. The kind of handwriting that looks like it was moving fast because the thought was moving faster than the pen. No draft, no revision. Just the thing itself, written once and folded. He wrote that he remembered what Barry had told him that night in New York. He wrote that he had thought about it more than Barry probably realized. He wrote that if Barry wanted to play something tonight, one song, the choice was entirely his. Song, tempo, key, how long, whether at all. None of it would be decided by anyone other than Barry. No announcement in advance. No corner. He had someone bring it to Barry's dressing room. The answer came back on a piece of paper torn from something. 4 words in Barry's handwriting. Yes. My song, though. Lennon read it twice. He didn't send anyone back to ask which song. He could have. He chose not to, because pressing for that detail would have been its own small version of the same mistake. The offer was trust without conditions. Asking for the set list would have been taking one condition back. The show moved through its first segments the way live television moves. Slightly faster than comfortable, slightly louder than necessary. Lennon was good at it, sharper on his feet than people expected, funnier than his public image suggested. He knew how to be in a room. Then he walked to the edge of the small stage and said something the producers hadn't scripted. He said there was someone he wanted to introduce, but he was going to do it differently than he had done it once before. He said he was going to step back, and whatever happened next was not his to decide. He turned toward the side of the stage. Chuck Berry walked out. There was no roar because this was a television studio with a small live audience, not an arena, and that smallness turned out to matter. The lack of scale made it more honest. Berry nodded at the studio band, said something quiet to the piano player, and the piano player found the opening of something old. A 12-bar blues that most people in that studio would have known from childhood without being able to name it. The kind of song that predates the point where songs have authors. When Barry started to sing, his voice was not doing anything extra. That's the only way to describe it. He wasn't projecting, wasn't performing, wasn't trying to fill the room. He was just singing the song, and the song was doing the rest. Lennon was standing a few feet to the side. He hadn't planned to do anything. He was going to stand there and let Barry have the moment he had been handed, which was the entire point. But the melody got to him before his intentions could catch up. He had heard this song, or something so close to it that the difference didn't matter, on records in Liverpool. His uncle had played something like it on evenings when nobody was in a particular hurry to be anywhere else. And before he understood what was happening, he was humming it under his breath. Not quietly enough. Barry heard it. He turned his head slightly. He didn't stop singing. He tilted the microphone a few degrees in Lennon's direction. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was small enough that the cameras almost missed it. But Lennon understood it, and he stepped forward and sang. Not a handoff, not a duet with a structure and a plan. Just 2 people who had arrived at the same melody from different directions, finding themselves in the same place at the same time. The studio went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something shifts from being television into being something else entirely. When it ended, there were a few seconds where nobody did anything. Then the applause came, and it was real, which is not always true of applause in a television studio. Backstage afterward, Barry found Lennon near the corridor and asked him something. He asked why he thought it had felt different from most moments on a stage. Lennon thought about it and said he didn't fully know. Barry said it was because neither of them had been trying to be the thing people expected. Not the ex-Beatle, not the man who built the architecture of rock and roll. Just 2 people singing something that was there before either of them and would be there after both. He said the distance between performing and actually doing something is trying. The moment you stop working to be the version of yourself that exists in other people's heads, whatever's actually underneath gets a few seconds to come through. Lennon asked how you hold on to that when the version of yourself in other people's heads gets larger every year and harder to separate from the real one. Barry said he didn't always manage it himself, that the ease people saw in him had taken 20 years of hard and costly work to build. But some nights, if the conditions are right and you're honest at the same time, you get a few minutes of just being a person instead of a name on a marquee. He said Lennon had given him that tonight, not a spotlight, a door. 8 years later, on the morning of December 9th, 1980, Chuck Berry heard the news the way most of the world heard it, suddenly and without any preparation for what it would feel like. He didn't release a statement. People close to him said he sat with it for a long time and didn't say much to anyone. What he was thinking about, nobody can say with certainty. But somewhere in that silence, there was probably a studio corridor in New York and a piece of paper with 4 words written on it, a piano finding the opening of a song that nobody wrote alone, and a voice humming underneath his, not performing anything, not trying to be anything, just a man who had heard this melody as a boy in the north of England a long time ago, and still knew every note without ever having learned them properly. The last time he heard that voice, it wasn't trying to be John Lennon. That's the part that stays with you when everything else fades out. Not the mistake, not the fame, not the tragedy that came 8 years later without warning. The part that stays is a folded note and 4 words and a microphone tilted a few degrees toward a man who was already humming something he learned before he knew who he was going to become.